A few more people. Go ahead and get started. And can you see my screen now? Perfect. Yep. So today's talk is on Kubernetes, the good, the bad, and the misconfigured. For today's talk, we've got myself. I'm Rachel Sweeney. Actually not a site reliability engineer. I should have fixed that on the slide. But I worked here as a site reliability engineer. So worked with a lot of our clients, helping them run Kubernetes effectively, helping them when things catch fire and figuring out why they caught fire and how we make sure that doesn't happen again, securing stuff, all that good stuff. And I'm joined by John. John, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. John Hashem, one of the solution architects here at Fairwinds. So I help our customers be successful on our Insights platform. Thanks for joining us.
All right. So let's see, what have we got? So yeah, at Fairwinds, our mission here is to be the trusted partner for Kubernetes security, policy, and governance. At Fairwinds, we help customers ship cloud-native applications faster, more cost-effectively, and with less risk. And we provide a unified view between dev, sec, and ops and remove the friction between those teams with software that simplifies complexity. So what that means is essentially we spend all day, every day, looking at Kubernetes across all the different departments here at Fairwinds. We manage clusters for clients. We help people architect different things for Kubernetes. We, have a software as a service that helps people get better at Kubernetes. Kind of see all these different areas and use that knowledge to develop open source tools so that everybody can benefit, as well as putting them into our software as a service. And so through that process, we've certainly learned a lot. We've got a lot of really smart people here, and we're going to share some of the stuff that we've learned along the way. So if you look at the proper configuration counts, we can see this is from, I believe, a survey that we did a little while ago, or I can't remember, this was from the, do you remember where this was from, Dave? Was this from the big survey?
Yeah, I think it was from the configuration benchmark report.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and in that report, only 35% of organizations have correctly configured most of their workloads with liveness and readiness probes. And this is a big one. When people first get into Kubernetes, there's a lot of things that they don't know that they don't know. And out of the box, there's a lot of things it's not going to handle for you. It's not going to be as reliable as it could be. There's some configuration settings you have to put. And so a good example of that is with liveness and readiness probes. If you want to have zero downtime deployments when you're in Kubernetes, you really need to have readiness probes configured, because as soon as you upgrade from one version of an app to another one, traffic will start diverting to the new one even before it's ready. And so when that happens, you're going to drop packets, data is going to get missed essentially. And so you want to make sure you have readiness probes configured so that it can let Kubernetes know that, hey, it's time to send traffic that way without having to drop it. So you hear a lot about zero downtime deployments. That's one of the pieces you need to do with Kubernetes. And liveness probes is another one that comes up where if a pod in Kubernetes, if it's dying off, we need to have some way of checking to see that that happens. And we actually had a client for one of their clusters that we manage, and they did not have liveness probes configured, and they had a horizontal pod autoscaler that would scale out their workloads based on how many jobs were in a queue. And because they didn't have liveness probes configured, half of their workloads showed up as, everything's just fine, even though the other half were failing, and it actually never scaled out. So they woke up one morning, there was a huge backlog of work, they were very panicked, and we had to help them through it, and then, showed them, if you configure liveness probes, you won't have this issue going forward. So if you want your cluster to scale, that's a great way to do it. Anything you want to add from what you've seen, John?
I think it's a great point, Rachel. I think this comes into perspective when customers talk about moving to production or kind of that production readiness. This seems like definitely a few things you want to have in place. So great points.
That's a really good point. Yeah, in dev, you get it up and running, but you don't get all that, you don't get that load testing that you would from in prod. And you certainly can do load testing to help uncover some of that, but it's definitely want to make sure you have these configured before you go into prod. If it's going to have any kind of meaningful traffic to it. So what else do we have? Only 42% of organizations today manage to lock down most of their workloads. Do you see this a lot, John? I know you work with a lot of clients.
Yeah, I see this quite often. I think it's one of the most kind of difficult things to tackle because security is top of mind for a lot of organizations, but sometimes it takes a backseat when it comes to configuration. So yeah, definitely this is something that customers are always working on and making sure that they are secure. So absolutely.
That's a good point. I think one thing that people don't often realize is Docker, with all of its the security calls that it does, or all the syscalls that it does, it automatically locks down, I think, all but like 63 syscalls. So that's what you're allowed to make. And in Kubernetes, it's a little more flexible. Like, one of the beautiful things about Kubernetes is it is so flexible and we can do so much with it, but it is less secure than Docker is by default. I think I reversed that. I think with Docker, there's like 23 syscalls you can make. And I think with Kubernetes, it's as many as 63. And so it's a lot more permissive out of the box, but there's a lot more configuration that can be done there. So those are things that we need to lock them down and make sure that we are aware of these things, making sure that things like host path is not enabled unless it's absolutely necessary. Because if it is enabled and somebody breaks into a container, they could get access to the root file system underneath, or the underlying file system. And so without locking down certain things, it's a little bit not easy, but there are ways to break out of the container. And so the more things we lock down like that, the harder it is to break out of the container. And then the more we limit that blast radius. So that's certainly a good thing to look at and think about. What else do we have? So yeah, 54% of people have said that, they are leaving over half of their workloads open to privilege escalation and thus security holes. This is pretty similar to the previous one, but there's actually a flag in Kubernetes, which is pretty simple, and it's just allow privilege escalation, true or false. By default, it's set to true, and all you have to do is set it to false. It tends to be pretty low hanging fruit. There are some workloads that it could break, but I think for most of them, it won't be an issue. So that's one of those things that you have to look out for and be aware of. These are great things to test in dev. Some of these flags you just toggle on and off. So you can say allow privilege escalation set to false, test it out in dev, make sure everything works exactly as it did before, and we go from there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think one thing to that kind of is reading a book this weekend, and one thing that's I knew, but I was just kind of surfaced itself as you're looking at a node within Kubernetes and scheduling of the workloads is it's a shared kernel. So you have that that kernel. So if you have an issue where you're allowing privilege escalation, there's opportunity for other things to happen within that cluster. So it really kind of opens your eyes up when you think about it.
Yeah, it is pretty scary just how many ways there are to do damage once you get in if you don't have those controls in place. So yeah, that's a great point. All right, so infrastructure as code scanning helps with proper Kubernetes configuration, vital to the success of cloud native adoption. And so, yeah, do you want to take this one, John?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so this is a quite an interesting component here is especially with proper Kubernetes configuration. Infrastructure as code is obviously the way to go, and you have a lot of different ways to do that. It does get super challenging, especially where a lot of different development teams are deploying workloads into the cluster. And that's an opportunity where misconfigurations can ideally happen, and having that control over what's being deployed is obviously kind of front and center for most organizations. So just making sure you have a consistent way to kind of put some guardrails in place and on what's coming into the cluster is important, because there's a lot of Rachel mentioned there's just a flag to allow privilege escalation, but that's also important to remember. Do people even know where it lives within infrastructure as code? I was talking to an organization fairly recently, and one thing they mentioned is Well, I know where it is. I'm an operator of these clusters, but my developers don't even know where it is. Is it in the pod spec, the container spec? Like, where is this thing that you want me to make true or false? So ideally, if it's missing, that's still a misconfiguration, because there's a lot of kind of hidden knowledge, especially where the Kubernetes ecosystem is changing all the time and new things are being added or deprecated or introduced as beta. It really starts to make things super complex. So making sure you're scanning your artifact of choice or your kind of system of record is super important.
Yeah, those are great points. And, when we think of like shifting things left, this is a great way to do that for infrastructure as code. And, this can be like shifting security left, where we're scanning the images that are coming into our cluster. And this can also just be like John was mentioning, scanning the YAML files that we are deploying into our Kubernetes cluster. Do these have the proper configurations? And one of the beautiful things about doing this is we catch the issues before they get into the cluster, because by the time they're in the cluster, it's a lot more expensive to fix those issues. It might require a little bit of reworking of like your Docker file, for example. Maybe you are running as root and your app depends on that. You can't just change a flag on Kubernetes because that's going to break the Docker file, which requires root. And so the earlier on we can catch these misconfigurations, the better it is. And then there's just less technical debt to worry about. If you have a system in place to constantly scan for these things and catching them early, you don't have to go back after the fact to fix those issues. It's good to catch them up front.
Good point.
So, yep, I think I jumped the gun a little bit on this one, but yeah, infrastructure scanning and security. Do you want to go on with this one as well?
Sure, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of another area as well. There's a lot of different things to implement when we're looking for infrastructure as code. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different fields and things that you want to make sure you have in place. And ideally, organizations are looking to scale quicker and making sure product gets to market. And as part of that, you want to make sure you're reducing, as mentioned here, human error. There's a lot of like people building templates and different items that they want to make sure are in place. And once you start to defer outside of that, you need a way to put some checks and balances in place to make sure that what is going into your environment is actually what you set forth in your organization.
Yeah, and it mentions that looking for a tool that can find security holes before they become full-blown breaches. This is something that we'll often see. And I know how John mentioned that like people will often have templates that they share from person to person. And it's not a bad pattern, because if everybody's building off of the same secure template, that can certainly be helpful. But at the same time, it's still not catching like, what if somebody doesn't use the template, or what if they just pulled something off the internet and they're running that? Does that fit within the best practices of the template? And so it's great to just be able to scan for these things early on. And certainly with security, thinking about, we were talking about like, what if you have host path enabled or privilege escalation set? If we can catch these security vulnerabilities early on, we can help to, help prevent a full-blown breach from occurring. And if we don't catch the security vulnerability, maybe this container gets compromised. Hopefully we've got the best practices in place to limit that blast radius, but if not, at that point, if you break out of the container, you can get into the node. If you're on the node, you can probably get cloud credentials. A lot of the, in AWS, EC2 has a lot of credentials there that can access certain things with the API. So what can you do with those credentials? Any attacker is going to start to think through, what do I have access to and how much more can I escalate? Can I break out of the node and get into the cloud account? I don't know, it depends on how that's set up. So this is one of those early on steps. You had to shift scanning to the left, get that before it's even in your cluster. And it's just another step to help make sure we don't run into bigger issues later. So another thing here is with infrastructure's code scanning and efficiency. One thing that we've seen a lot is a lot of people will focus on, Kubernetes is pretty challenging if we're being honest, and there's a lot of tools to make it a lot easier, but we still see a lot of times where people are like, I just want to get this up and running in the cluster. And so a lot of teams will do what it takes to get it in the cluster. They'll start to tighten down some things, maybe around security, maybe around reliability, like liveness probes and readiness probes. But then when you're thinking about, resource requests and limits, maybe they requested like 4 gigabytes of memory because that, they didn't want it to crash, for example. And so now they've moved it to production and they have all of these workloads that are using way more resources than they actually need. And so we've had a number of clients where we've worked with them and we've just identified ways where they could literally save thousands of dollars a month. I think for one customer, it was actually above $10,000 a month, just because they use that same templating style that John mentioned, where they had a template and all the devs just kind of passed it around and everybody just put their app into that template, shipped it off into Kubernetes, and everybody was just using a ton of memory that they didn't need, or rather they weren't using it, they were requesting it, but not using it. And since Kubernetes is so good at scaling once it's set up properly, it was like, everybody wants 4 gigabytes, everybody gets 4 gigabytes. And then suddenly the cluster's using who knows how much memory, when really you could be using like a third of that or a quarter or more. And so that's another great thing to shift left.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, this is probably one of my favorite topics to talk about with clients. And something when you look at the way you're deploying to Kubernetes, a lot of assumptions are made with, utilizing like a Helm chart. You have default values, so that's, what you run with as well. But over time, and especially the cloud being metered, your organization is making a lot of assumptions based on what you have sized. So when they're making commitments to the cloud provider, or they're looking to, spend more on the cloud, any type of utilization that's being consumed today is what you're telling the organization that you need in the future, which when you look at commitments to the cloud provider, those are 1 or 3 year commitments. So making sure you're sized appropriately is super important. And ideally, you're getting to the point where the organization can be more comfortable moving workloads into Kubernetes because it is cost efficient. And ideally, Kubernetes relies on these decisions that you're making because it's, scheduling these workloads accordingly. So it's extra important to keep your eyes and ears open to sizing your infrastructure.
And there's, just to add one more thing, is there is a great open source tool called Goldilocks. And Goldilocks helps with these recommendations. It sets up a vertical pod autoscaler just to take the recommendations. Happy to get in the weeds later during the Q&A section if people are interested, but it essentially looks at those recommendations and says, based on how this workload is doing and how much use it's getting, this is how much memory you should request. Here's how many CPU cores you should request. It's a great way to start to look at that. So another thing is reliability. We talked about this a little bit and wanting to build in reliability from the start. And so the issue of CPU requests and limits, it's kind of in both camps, both reliability and efficiency. Interestingly enough, that tool Goldilocks I believe was actually designed for reliability, and then it was only after the fact that efficiency and cost is something that came up later. And so, with reliability and setting the appropriate requests and limits, it's important to set requests because without it, one thing people will often do is they will put a workload into Kubernetes. They won't set requests or limits for CPU or memory. And Kubernetes actually has a hierarchy of which workloads are the most important ones to it. And when a Kubernetes node starts to get resource constrained, the first thing the kubelet does on the node is figure out, who do I need to evict from this node and kill off to free up resources for more critical workloads? The first people to hit the chopping block, or the first workloads, are the ones without resource requests and limits set. So if you don't have resource requests and limits set on your workloads, as soon as a node starts to run into resource issues, that workload is one of the top contenders for being killed off by the kubelet. And it's kind of its own self-preservation way of doing things. It's just one of those things to think through, that if you want your workload to have the most reliability, you need to make sure where you are in that hierarchy and that you are setting resource requests and limits. An interesting thing is that the next one in that hierarchy is burstable workloads. So if you set a request at, let's say, like 1 CPU core and you set the limit at 2 CPU cores, you're essentially telling Kubernetes, give me 1 CPU core. I want to be able to use up to 2 CPU cores, but no more. And so if you exceed that, it will start to degrade the performance and you just won't let it go beyond it. When it comes to memory, it actually will kill off that workload because it'll get out of memory killed or killed. but it's still a higher priority than not setting anything. And then finally, if you set requests and limits at the same amount, that's actually, I think it's called a guaranteed workload, and they have the most preferential treatment whenever nodes start to run out of resources. So that's one piece. Liveness and readiness probes are another one. Anything else to add there, John?
I don't think so.
All right, moving on. Also, Trevor, thanks for the question. I'm going to get to questions in just a little bit. So if anyone else has any questions, please do drop them in chat and we will get to them in just a little bit. So yeah, at this point, we have a question for you. What is your greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? Is it A, getting help with the basics? B, general best practices, that kind of assessment? Is it C, improving the security posture of your clusters? Is it D, saving money? Or E, improving the reliability of apps running in Kubernetes? Should have got a poll that just popped up on your screen. If you don't mind voting in that, we will give the answer to you in just a second. Yeah, it is amazing. You know, I've been working with Kubernetes for like 3 years, and I feel like I'm still constantly learning so many things. Such a fun tool to work with. And yeah, I love working with John as well, because we just always like challenge each other and pick each other's brain. And we're like, wow, I didn't know that thing about Kubernetes. And then we dive deeper down the rabbit hole. And
Always try to keep it interesting.
Rachel, I've got the results of the poll here. It looks like about 27% of the attendees are looking for help, getting help with the basics. Same 27% looking for help with general best practices. 30% are looking to improve the security posture of their clusters. 8% are looking to save money. And the remainder are looking to improve the reliability of apps running in Kubernetes.
okay. Thank you, Dave. It sounds like the first two groups probably make up the majority towards getting help with the basics and best practice assessments. And then after that, security is pretty high in mind. With that, we have a demo for y'all. I'm going to switch it over to John. So John, if you don't mind sharing your screen.
That sounds great. Thanks, Rachel.
Of course. And yeah, it's great to know that we can focus on some of the basics, you know, getting stuff like that done in security.
Yeah, interested to see if it's kind of a wide or fairly consistent, approach here, about 20 or 30% across the board. So, yeah, thanks for the feedback here. I'm going to walk you through our Insights platform and kind of discuss some of those key areas that we mentioned earlier. So right now we're walking into kind of the cluster overview. This is a great way to see how your clusters are doing in regards to Kubernetes security, efficiency, and reliability. So those could be living in public cloud, those can be on-prem. It's a great way to visualize, how you're doing. We also provide a health score, which is weighted by, severity as well. So your most, critical severity levels are things like CVEs in the cluster. So they are ranked and provided a health score. So it's a great way to maybe in your organization see who has the healthiest cluster. A little bit of gamification here. You can also drill down to the appropriate clusters as well to get a little bit of a deeper dive as shown here. So over time, we're going to show you if you are, fixing more things or you have more things coming in as part of those violations. And the Insights platform provides those best practices that teams are looking for out of the box. So you have a wealth of expertise driven by our open source tooling from folks like Rachel in the organization. We're seeing problems with customers and are baked into the platform. So those could be things like readiness or liveness probes not being set, or you might not be setting resource requests and limits for CPU and memory. You might have different parts of security that you're missing in the organization. And you can bring this all the way to your CI process, all the way through to in cluster. So it gives you an opportunity to discover very early in your development lifecycle, as they say, shift left, all the way to the right, which is as they are running today.
Just to add to this real quick, Insights is a tool that takes a lot of the open source tools that are out there, and it kind of brings all that into one centralized platform. So you can see everything going on in your cluster. It is our SaaS offering. And so even if you're not interested in that, there's still a lot of valuable stuff that it can at least make you aware of. And so as we go through this demo, you'll see a lot of the stuff that you may not know about that you might want to be aware of. And you can look at our open source stuff, or if you just want to see everything all in one place, that is what Insights does. And so, so yeah, let's go through more of the stuff and see what all it's putting together.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. So this is your kind of starting point into the platform. You're looking at a cluster. So you can see, what are my top action items? What do I need to pay attention to? And thankfully, there's a tally here. So it's another way to help users within the platform figure out where they should be spending their time. You can see what version you're on. You can see if your costs are trending in the right direction. Then you can also see, what do you have running? So the amount of namespaces and pods, and then your Kubernetes version. So it's a great way to figure out, like, where should I start to navigate into the platform. We also have a section on the top here that gives a great way to figure out, what are my add-ons? So to make Kubernetes function appropriately, there's a lot of things that you need to expose services, to manage certificates, to manage things like monitoring, like Prometheus. And those are called add-ons. So we're actually checking which Helm charts are out of date. We can look at different cluster role and role bindings to see which ones are the most permissive here and rank them accordingly. Then the admission controller. This is probably one of the most interesting parts of the platform. As we talked about different things that are hitting the cluster, you have an opportunity with the admission controller. Think of as a way to validate objects before they persist in the cluster. And you can manage that across your entire Kubernetes environment to make sure they do not become do not run the cluster. So you can actually block those with certain rules that we create in the platform. And then the last part is just our install hub. These are all the open source tools that we have brought into the platform. So as Rachel mentioned, these are great things to check out. GitHub as well. There are a lot of them open source, all of them open source tools, just to say. So Polaris is built around best practices. So we were talking about setting the readiness and liveness probes. This is a core construct of the Polaris tool. Trivia is great for container scanning. You can build that right into your CI process. Super popular and allows organizations to identify risk earlier in their development lifecycle. The open policy agent, which is a way to create rules on top of the admission controller to kind of validate those different objects. And then we have some ones here for security, like Kubebench. This is built around the CIS benchmark, Center for Internet Security, super popular framework in regards to compliance. It's also in the EKS best practice framework as well. Nova, this is the add-ons that are out of date. Pluto's deprecated APIs and some other security tooling here for looking at RBAC, and also KubeHunter, which is built around the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Then we talked about workload sizing. There's kind of two ways you can do it within Goldilocks, which is leveraging the vertical pod autoscaler to provide it in recommendation mode, and also Prometheus, which allows us to give us a 2-week historical window.
Just to add to what John's mentioned here, there's a Kubernetes maturity model that kind of tracks really well with how people progress along their journey in Kubernetes. And all of these different tools, they kind of fall somewhere along that journey. And so for people that are more just getting started out, some of the tools that you're probably going to want to play with first are things like Polaris at the top there. Like John mentioned, pretty much everything here is open source. So please do go and install these, play with them. They're going to make you better at working with Kubernetes. They're going to make you just more reliable, efficient, and all that good stuff. So Polaris is a great one for anybody getting started. If they want to make sure that they're following best practices, Polaris is just going to help you with the majority of those. If you're concerned about upgrades, like I have to upgrade Kubernetes to 1.22, which is a big scary one since there's a lot of deprecated APIs, that's when you're going to want to use tools like Pluto and Nova. So for the people just getting started out, those are probably some of the top 3 that I would recommend. Polaris for configuration best practices, Pluto and Nova for doing upgrades. And then as you get more along the maturity model and you start to get comfortable deploying things to Kubernetes, things are set up the way they should be, that's when you want to be thinking more about things like Trivy. How do I incorporate that into my pipeline? Can I get that pretty far left? Should I scan in cluster? What do I do? And then finally, all the way on the end, that's when you can use things like the admission controller with the open policy agent. And then you can create your own policies. You can make sure that all those best practices that you have, you actually enforce them. And then you can block workloads from going in your cluster. because they don't match best practices. So yeah, just to reiterate what John was mostly saying, these are all open source. Feel free to play with them. If it's too much, Insights is also an option to keep it simple and keep it all in one place. And yeah, that's kind of where we're pulling all of this data from. All these different open source tools are pulled into this one platform.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Appreciate that clarity there. So now we're going to go one layer deeper. So now we start to figure out like what's in the cluster, what should we pay attention to? Now we're taking a peek at what we call action items. This is kind of your event-based view in the platform. So once things start to trigger in the platform and you're out of those best practices that it's looking for across all those different types of tooling here, then you can see what is affected, what's the path forward. And it's also a great way to understand what's going on. So for example, if I'm looking at best practices, I'd first be looking at things like Polaris. So I'm looking at, let me see if we got Polaris, okay. So we're looking at Polaris here. Now we can see privilege escalation should not be allowed. It's a high severity item, so very important to pay attention to for security-minded folks. I can see where the artifact lives. This is probably the most difficult part within Kubernetes, is just finding and navigating like where's the violation, like how do I get to it, especially where when you're looking at like command line, you have to always jump into different namespaces. It's very tricky to navigate the data that you're looking for, and there's too much data on top of that as well. And on the right-hand side, you can actually see if it's coming in, if it's recent, is it old data, like how fresh is this violation that's occurring? And then you can also see who it's assigned to. So if I have a lot of different security issues, and let's say Rachel's my security engineer, I would assign these all to Rachel so she can start to remediate those. And I can also see if they're being fixed. So are we moving forward? Are we achieving our goals, whether there are certain compliance standards or security measures in the organization?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, the way I think about this is you can get all this information from Polaris right now. If you go get it, it's open source, like we mentioned, you can install it in your cluster. But one of the beautiful things about Insights or having it in one place is you can automatically just connect it with Jira. So you can instantly create a ticket for it and get some other team to deal with it or whoever it might be. You can also send notifications to Slack. As soon as something comes into the cluster where privilege escalation is set to true, where it is allowed, you could have it immediately send a message in Slack to the security team just to let them know. Or you could have it sent to PagerDuty. Maybe there's some action item that comes up, PagerDuty gets notified from there. And there's just a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to consume this data and where you want to consume it. And so that's kind of the power of the platform, is that it takes all of this information and it makes it accessible in whatever way you want to consume it, rather than taking all of these different tools and kind of trying to string them all together on your own.
Yeah, it's a great point, Rachel. I think the biggest difference that we find within open source tools is they're great to use. When we start to introduce scale and multiple teams, this is where the Insights platform can ideally help, and also making the data actionable. I think there's no shortage of events that people are looking to fix and remediate, whether in the clusters or in the cloud environments. Trying to fit this into your workflow is super important as well. One thing I want to highlight as well is we kind of label this as self-service. This allows different users in the organization who they know they have to adhere to certain best practices across the different measures that their organization is putting forth, but they want to understand like what is it, like how do I remediate it, where do I find it? So this can really help with the enablement side of the house, especially when you're truly getting started with Kubernetes. It's super complex, things are changing, things are getting added and removed all the time. This can actually show you of what is the actual description. How do I remediate it? So, you told me this issue occurs, but how do I ultimately fix it? So you can see, exactly this is the line that you need to pay attention to in your organization, which can be tricky when there's so many different languages that you have to, pay attention to and use. So this makes it a lot easier to work with not only YAML, but figuring out where does it live to truly make that change. Right. And last thing I'll bring up as well is right on the top here, this is another way to help and kind of roll up and aggregate your issues. So you might find that you might have a bunch of things that are going on in the organization, but it usually comes down to what we call like themes. I like to kind of internalize that, so makes sense sometime of, how do you move forward? So we're looking at things like, image pull policy should be set to always. This is making sure you're not using cached images. It's always pulling down a fresh image, which is a great best practice that we have from Polaris here. So when you're looking at, 238 objects, you can see like, where do they live? So where's the biggest impact? And that's the thing that you want to, really move forward is how can I make the biggest change, or how can I make a small change that'll make the biggest impact across my organization? So these themes will start to present themselves into the platform. All right, we're going to make a jump point off to everyone's favorite here, which is efficiency. So this is going back to the earlier point of CPU requests, memory requests, and limits. So you can actually aggregate and see, how your cluster is doing here. And what I mean by that is when you're starting to add nodes to Kubernetes, each of them have a capacity for CPU and memory. But if you add 2, 5, 10 of them collectively, like how much capacity does this cluster actually have? You can see what users are requesting for their workloads. So they're saying, this is the kind of the minimum that I want to say I need from Kubernetes. You can also look at the utilization. And this is, ideally the request, it's what you're scaling off in your environment. So a lot of times we'll see they only have a little bit of usage, and you'll see this capacity bar way over to the right here. So this is where maybe you're using too large of a node size. And the common thing to think about is with when you're looking at a node or an instance type, let's say in AWS, every size down from a 4XL, like say using an M5 4XL to a 2XL, it's a 50% savings. So you can really start to understand kind of the level of impact, and not just at the node level or the cluster level. You can even do that even further at the workload level as well. And all the way to the right here, this is the limit. This is the kind of most amount of CPU memory that I'm requesting from each of the different workloads added. And this is on a 30-day average. You can do this most recent as well to get a finer data point across CPU and memory. And then a little bit below here, we're showing kind of cost over time. So you can see your most expensive cluster. You can also start to understand like why maybe all of our clusters are close to the same, but you have one that's way over, way over and above. That could be an opportunity to investigate as well. Same for utilization. So, if you have a lot of data or a lot of clusters that are not being utilized appropriately, that could be an opportunity to maybe schedule more workloads on that cluster. That can be an opportunity where maybe that needs to be kind of sunsetted and removed because it's not really being used anymore, kind of that orphan workload type of discussion that could be had in the organization. So this is another kind of visual component of the areas that you're looking for not only efficiency, but costing as well.
Yeah, this is such a fun one. At my previous job, I've been working with Kubernetes about 3 years or so. And when I first set up a Kubernetes cluster and we got it going in prod, we were like, now how do we think about cost? And, there really is not a ton of really good tools out there for figuring it out. And this has been so helpful for a lot of people for figuring out how are my different clusters looking? How much resources are they using? And just being able to compare quickly across them all. Looks like there's at least, 5 there, and we can just quickly see how they all track pretty closely. And, if there's some way that you could reduce the resources in one of those, since they're all tracking closely, you could probably do that for all of them since they look fairly similar. And yeah, there's just a lot of ways to play around with it and just get that quick high-level snapshot.
Yeah, great point, Rachel. And once we kind of find a cluster of interest, now we can kind of drill down. And I just got to obviously have this one set up a little bit ahead of time here. So now looking at alpha prod, this is looking at the individual cluster. I can see what it's costing. And then I can get a little bit lower level view of those costing metrics at a singular view here. So this is a great way to take a peek at how this cluster is doing. And now I can go one layer deeper and look at node capacity. And you can see the legend below. This is showing my request around 93%, and my limits are set much higher than that, which could be you know, depending on how you want this to be set in your organization, this is another way to kind of flag a visual representation of what you're looking for. And as you have more nodes in the environment, those actually look pretty neat. It'll actually be almost like a honeycomb view. So you can start to see the outliers within efficiency across the cluster. And I'm going to go one layer deeper. So this is the workload section. So I'm going to go just right here. This is looking at all of the workloads within Alpha Prod. I can see what's my most expensive asset, what is my cost over time. So you can represent that data a few different ways. Obviously, in a production environment, you're probably going to cost a few more than, you know, a little more than $1 here, but you get the idea here of how that would work. And a couple of things to keep in mind is, you know, when you start to look at, you know, this is a small environment, you get 122 different workloads. The thing you want to think about is impact. Like, where can you make the biggest bang for your buck when you're starting to, you know, reduce the size of the workloads? So a couple of things you can do is, you know, you can sort to say, what is my biggest saver that I want to start to take a look at? So let's say it's core DNS. I can take a look at memory and CPU. And this is a great way to kind of represent the behavior. So if you say, you know, if you're looking at, let's say, you know, some monitoring, you see like, hey, this workload is completely oversized. You know, a lot of people say like, you know, show me, what is the impact? Like what can I actually change here? This will show you what your requests and limits are set at and what is the recommendation over time. And you also have some way to justify that. So, you know, if you're taking a user in the organization like an SRE or, you know, DevOps folk away from their role, and they need to, you know, perform these tasks of making some of these changes, you can kind of measure impact to see like, hey, this is, you know, a few $1,000s of savings every single month that we want to make that change. You know, as Rachel mentioned, some customers of over, you know, $10,000. If you look at like that from a dollars perspective, yeah, it makes sense to make these changes because over time, you know, it could be a 6-figure impact for your clusters, which in turn will pay for new innovation. Maybe will free up some budget, you know, within your in your cost center, whatever it may be. Like there's a way to kind of justify someone doing this actual work, which is usually the most important. I think there's no shortage of optimizations to be made in an organization, but the most important thing to pay attention to is the juice worth the squeeze, I think is what they say sometimes. So this is a way to kind of visually represent that. Anything you want to add here, Rachel?
No, this is, yeah, it's very helpful. It's nice seeing that time series data so we can see like how much resources do we actually need for that workload. I'm very excited for the security and vulnerability section if you have time for that. So
I think we do. That is a great jump point. So let's take a look at vulnerabilities. Probably everyone's favorite here. So when you start to look at, you know, vulnerabilities, there's obviously tons of images. They live in all different places. You can see we have, you know, some Jenkins images or some deployments. Looks like we got some tickets outstanding. We can actually go one layer deeper here and start to really understand, like, can we make a change for this particular image? A lot of times that you find is that, hey, there's some, you know, vulnerabilities present, but is there an actual fix? Like, is there a path forward? This can make it very easy for organizations to understand that. And we also, great part about being a SaaS platform is new innovations and fun things happening all the time. We recently introduced auto scanning for GitHub. So when you have new repositories that are coming online, they can automatically be brought into the platform and scanned, that you can make sure you're secure, efficient, reliable automatically. So you take a lot of the legwork around feeding the data into the platform. So when we look at something like this here, we can see this has a lot of things I should pay attention to, but where should I start? I'm probably going to start where is there a fix available? How can I make my mark in reducing vulnerabilities in the organization? This is one way, and we also have within our action item section, base image recommendations. So you can start to understand, a lot of times we'll see is, hey, this image has 150 vulnerabilities. If you go down to this image, which is a few versions newer, you might go down to 20. So that's a fairly big jump for a simple change, but you can really understand, like, what is the move? What should I actually be doing here? And then you can filter by packages. So for example, if you want to get away from, you know, curl or something, you can start to justify that risk. Or now we can go one layer deeper here and say, here's the CV, here's the hyperlink, here's the install version, here's my fix. It looks like just patch version update here, and see the title and description. So now I can understand like what is actually occurring and have some data to make my decision.
Yeah, one thing I really like about that as well is, that's something we can set up in this platform to send stuff to Slack. Maybe a critical vulnerability comes in, maybe it's in a particular namespace or something. You can have it just immediately notify Slack, like if there's a fix available, for example. Just a lot of ways to connect with and consume this data. And yeah, it's a great thing to shift left as well, like John was saying.
Yeah, this is one way to take a look at it. One of the most popular ways is, ideally in your CI, you're going to see some of these changes being presented. The repositories view, it's actually got reworked fairly recently. So now this is using our auto scan capability. You can see your top repositories, you can see your top issues. So not only is it security related, but you can also see some of those efficiency checks. So, hey, I'm missing labels. I didn't set any, CPU requests, which is something that I want to be doing. And you can also see below what has actually been performed here. So it's another way to not only looking at risk for security, but also looking across those different best practices as well. And I'll show you one more thing here, and then we'll start to move on to some questions here. So I think we'll go to, this is automation rules. So this is another way to introduce behavior into the Insights platform. So I kind of showed you ways to navigate to look for different pieces or findings that are super important across those three pillars: security, efficiency, and reliability. But ideally, you want to have, there's going to be something that your organization is going to be standardizing. So you might have, hey, if this particular artifact lives in this namespace, maybe it's something that's working as intended because there's not a fix available, or you're going to fix this within, let's say a new release. You can start to set these rules. Also something that Rachel brought up, which is the Slack integration. You can be looking for certain events and just filter them to Slack. I think there's no shortage of, alerts and events that, users are starting to look after. This is a way to introduce kind of behavior. So whatever that you're thinking you want the platform to do, this is a great way to kind of automate. We always take a stance of kind of automating and making sure things are either living as infrastructure as code, or making sure that behavior is driven from kind of your thoughts. You don't have to kind of click around the UI all the time and look for things to create tickets. You can say, if this is in a namespace and it's this event type and it's brand new, let's send it to Slack. Or let's say we're not going to fix this because maybe this is, a bug that needs to be, fixed fairly recently. All right. So if you don't have anything to add here, I'm going to skip over to our questions here. I guess we'll take a look in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you, John. One thing real quick, if you don't mind letting me share my screen. There's
one absolutely.
I wanted to share, and then we'll get on to those questions. The last thing is we have this Kubernetes misconfiguration white paper. It's on, same topic, Kubernetes, the good, the bad, and the misconfigured. It's got a lot of good stuff on security, cost optimization, reliability, and policy enforcement. And if you look here, there is a link, which I think we can put in the chat as well. And that's where you can find that. It's going to give you a lot more of that information as well for you to go over. So make sure you check that out. Yeah, Dave's going to connect you with that as well. And yeah, with that, I think that was the last slide. So for the Q&A, it looks like Trevor asked a little while ago, we have liveness and readiness probe set up. It's been spend time manually figuring out proper settings. Any tips? When you talk about manually figuring out proper settings, are you talking about for all of the other checks, like all of the other best practices? If that is the case, then Polaris is definitely the place to go. I first started using Polaris at my last job, and when I was new to Kubernetes, even if you're not new to Kubernetes, it's going to show you so much good stuff. And I really learned a tremendous amount about Kubernetes and, Docker containers, how they isolate processes and stuff, just by using Polaris. Do you have the host network enabled, or do you have access to it? Yeah, can you get to the host PID, stuff like that. Those are all things that Polaris will tell you whether they are configured correctly or not. And it will even go a step further and show you why you want to configure those. It'll give you a little information about that. So if you're looking time for how to figure out, if you're looking to figure out how to manually configure all those proper settings, Polaris is the tool for that. It's going to show you how to do all that. So.
I think that's it. I don't see any others. Feel free to ask any questions. Happy to answer them when we have the time here.
Trevor asked, does Insights work with EKS? The answer is yes, it does. Do you want to add anything to that, John?
No, it's a great point, Sip. So Insights platform works with all of your managed, Kubernetes. It also works with customers using things like COPS as well. So yeah, we have plenty of customers that are working with kind of all different flavors of Kubernetes.
There's some great plugins with EKS and Insights specifically, or slightly broader with AWS and Insights specifically. So whether you're running EKS or you're hosting Kubernetes yourself on AWS, Insights has a AWS cost plugin to look at your billing data. So you can actually get, really, really finely grained cost recommendations, I think down to the penny or so. Like it's pretty incredibly accurate. So when you see that graph that John was showing that showed the cost recommendations with the time series data, that's where the billing data from that AWS cost plugin will come into play. And the two of those working together will, really inform your decision for changing these memory and CPU requests. How much will that actually impact the bottom line? And that's a piece of Insights that works really well with AWS for showing that. Got a few more minutes, so happy to take any other questions anybody has about Kubernetes, their journey, any of these open source tools or insights. All right, well, if we don't have any more questions, we want to thank you all for coming. Hope you learned a few things. Hopefully you feel better about your journey in Kubernetes and ways to improve, your posture wherever you are. And if you have any more questions, do feel free to reach out to us. I think Dave will share some information as well. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.